Well, it's great to welcome you back as we are continuing our studies of New Testament Greek. We're coming to a very important chapter this time. This is chapter 18 and introduces to us the topic of participles. You probably have a vague memory of participles from your study of junior high or high school grammar. You know that participles generally are words that will have an ing on the end, sometimes called a gerund. So I can talk about run. I run down the street, or I can use the participle running down the street, you see. Something like that is the way that participles are used in Greek, but the one thing you need to bear in mind is that in many ways, understanding the very subtle applications of the use of participles in Greek is one of the most important keys to understanding the basic syntax of the language that you could possibly imagine. In many ways, once you start understanding participles, you'll realize that this is in many ways the backbone of the Greek language. And so I want you to pay special attention to this chapter and chapter 19 and chapter 20. Those three chapters all have to do with participles. We're going to find chapter 18, the chapter before us right now, is going to be what's called the present participle. Chapter 19 will introduce the aorist participle, and then chapter 20, the aorist passive participle. And if you really do get a feel for participles from these three chapters, then really the rest of it kind of comes together pretty naturally. If these don't quite get into your understanding, you're going to find that many other things are confusing as well. So I'm going to spend a little more time on this chapter, and hopefully by the time we've worked through it, worked through the examples, worked through the exercises, you'll have some pretty good idea what's going on with participles. The first thing to notice, and Machen makes this point himself, is that participles are what's called verbal adjectives. You know that an adjective is a word that describes a person, place, or thing. I can say a man, I can say a good man, and of course the word good is being used to modify the word man, telling me what sort of man I'm talking about there. Now, I could also use a form of a verb to describe a man. So let's take the verb run. Normally, run is a verb. I run down the street, you know, that sort of thing. I run to the opportunity to study Greek. But I could also take the word run, put ing on the end of it. It becomes the word running, and then I can use that word to modify the word man. So I can speak of the running man, you see. Now that's not a sentence, is it? The running man is simply telling me the man I'm speaking of, and then I could go ahead and say something else about him. The running man is studying Greek. Well, he's studying Greek while he's running, possibly. I don't know how he does that. But the point is, the word running is not the verb in the sentence, but it's rather a descriptor for the word man. And so the running man is a kind of adjectival verb. You see, it's describing the word man in terms of that use of the verb. I could also put the word run into some kind of separate tense. I could say the man, the having run man, you see, was studying Greek. Well, in that sense, it's kind of awkward English, but you get the point. It's saying the man having run, having already accomplished that, is now proceeding to study Greek. And again, that would be the way in which the aorist participle is used. So in this lesson, we're taking a look at the present participle, which actually describes action that is taking place at the same time, concurrent with what's called the leading verb in the sentence. In my sentence, the man studies Greek, study is the leading verb, and then running would be a participle describing action happening concurrently with the time of the leading verb. The running man studies Greek. Maybe he's studying Greek while he's jogging or something like that. But that's the idea. So that's the basic sense. Now, the Greek participle also has some subtlety to it. I can use it in what's called the attributive position. And in that case, I would actually use the word the in connection with running and then reuse it with respect to the word man. So I could say something like this. Now, this is literal Greek, understand. This is not good kind of smooth speaking English, but literally the Greek would read something like this. The man, the running down the street one, you see. The running down the street man. Now in that case, if I were going to try to translate that into English, I would probably substitute for the word the word who, the man who is running down the street. And so that's the way to think about translating it. But before you worry about translating it, learn to think of it the very way the Greek thinks of it. Learn to think of it rather literally, even though it'll seem a little bit stilted. The man, the running down the street one would be more close to the actual literal reading of the Greek. There's also the so-called substantive use of the participle. This is very similar to the substantive use of the adjective. You recall we could use the word good, the good, die young, you recall that. Well, I could also speak of the running down the street ones, or the running down the street men, and let it stand by itself. And in that case, we'd have what's called the substantive use of the participle. Now, this is kind of a very, very rapid summary of the basic heart of what's going on in this chapter. I want you to read the chapter. In fact, you really should have read the chapter before looking at this little introduction to it. And if you haven't, I'd suggest you read it first before we proceed. But what I'd like to do now is actually take a look at the two words that are part of the vocabulary list. Machen gives us a break in this chapter. The substance of this chapter is challenging enough that he doesn't want to burden us with additional vocabulary words, so we'll only have two words to deal with. But I do want to look at the examples themselves. I think that probably is the best way to get a feel for how the participle is used. So let's go ahead and take a look at the vocabulary words, and then we'll take a look at the examples. And then, of course, as usual, we'll finish up by looking at the first three of each of the exercises at the end of this chapter. All right, well, let's take a look at these two vocabulary words. The first of them, you'll notice, is the word proserchomai. Proserchomai. Notice that it is deponent. You should recognize erchomai. We've, of course, had that. It means to come or to go. And you're not surprised to see that when we add the preposition to the first of it, pros, it comes to mean I come to, or you go to, if you go ahead and conjugate it, that sort of thing. Takes the dative, so if you have this verb, you'll use it with the dative, I come to the house. To oiko, the house, would be in the dative case, so that's pretty straightforward. Actually a word that is very similar to what we've already had, so no surprises there. Somewhat more challenging is going to be the vocabulary words on, usa, on. These are the participles connected to the verb eimi. You know that eimi means I am, and we might need in some cases to say something about being in the house, being on the street. And this would generally be the term that's used. It has to do with a state of being, and we'll just have to see how that works out in the exercises, but it's going to be the participle that is applied to that verb of being. So that's the sense of it. We'll say more about that as we go along. Now, if you're looking at the first page of Machen's chapter 18, you see this somewhat daunting list of various forms of the word luo, and these all represent various ways in which you will find the participle of the word luo. The reason we have so many of these is because, of course, we have a word which has both a kind of noun aspect to it, but also a verb aspect to it. And so you're going to notice that as far as the verb aspect is concerned, we're going to have both the active and the middle and passive forms, which come on the next page there. Those have to do with the verb form of this, but also we have all of these various endings that are connected with the way in which it can be used with respect to its noun aspects. So we have the nominative, the genitive, the dative, the accusative here. And of course, we're going to have the masculine, the feminine, and the neuter. And so we have, and then of course we have the singular and the plural. So you add all those together, you get this variety of forms of luo. But the good news is that you'll notice that the endings are actually endings you've already learned. So we have luon, luontos, luonti, luonta. And you'll recall, because you studied diligently chapter 17, didn't you? And as I told you then, these are the endings that not only apply to the third declension, which we learned in chapter 17, but which also apply in the case of participles. So you notice both in the masculine and in the neuter, we have these endings that we learned in connection with the third declension. So you're not learning anything new here. You're simply applying it in a new context. When we come to the feminine, we notice that these are actually your standard first declension endings. So luusa, luuses, luuse, luusan. Notice a short alpha puts the acute back on the antepenult, pursuant to the rules of verb accent. When we get to the plural side, we've got luantes, luanton, luusi, luantas. Again, these are endings that we already learned in connection with the third declension. And similarly here, we find these standard third declension endings. When we come to the feminine, again, these are first declensions. So luusai, luuson. Remember, according to Rule 51, we're going to have the circumflex on the ultima in the genitive plural of the first declension. Luuses, long, ultima leaves the acute accent on the penult, lilac pen, and luusas, here the alpha, which could be theoretically either long or short, is in this case long, and so also we have the accent here. So, even though it looks like a whole lot of endings, and I sympathize with you, I was somewhat shocked the first time I saw this chapter years and years ago, but was pleased to find out that really the good work I'd done in chapter 17 paid off, and that it wasn't that difficult to learn these endings. So I hope you'll find your experience is similar. Let's take a look at the middle and passive endings as well before we proceed. The middle and passive endings are actually even more straightforward. These do not make use of the third declension, but actually this is simply the first and second declension endings. So you'll notice that luomenos, luomenu, luomino, luomenon. These are the second declension endings that you learned way back in the very early part of your studies. The long, ultima here in the genitive singular and in the dative singular drags the accent to the penult, so otherwise no surprises. When we come to the feminine, it's luomene, luomenes, luomene, luomenane. And again, you'll notice these endings are standard first declension endings, and so no surprises here. When we get to the neuter, it's about the same as we found in the masculine, except the neuter has the omicron nu, so it's luomenon, luomenu, luomino, luomenon. And that's, again, not the least bit surprising, and so these endings are fairly straightforward. Similarly, when we get to the plural side, luomenoi, luomenon, luomenois, luomenus. And again, the accent is going to vary depending on the length of the ultima, but otherwise, no surprises. Luomenai, luomenon, luomenes, luomenas. And again, you're going to notice that the long ultima moves the accent. This is a short alpha. The last alpha iota, of course, is always short. Here, luomena, luomenon, luomenois, luomena. And again, we have the neuter endings, largely first declension, and basically that's what we would expect to find. So, when it comes to the middle and passive, it's fairly straightforward, and if you've mastered these endings before, then you're not going to have any particular problem adding this to your repertoire. All right, now I'm looking at page 104 in the standard Machen text, and here he gives us the first example. And it's these examples that you do want to spend some time considering. It will certainly give you some insight into the way that participles are handled in Greek, and so I'm going to spend a little time on each one of these. The first one we have here is ho apostolos, the apostle, and then here is our first exposure to a participle, legon. You notice that the omega nu is the masculine singular nominative. Probably the easiest way when you're first starting to deal with participles is simply recognize the stem. This is the word lego, of course, And when you see a participle ending, regardless of what it is in terms of person, number, and case, that kind of thing, simply add ing to it. And that'll at least get you going. Now, you may need to massage your translation before you're done, but we're going to leave it at that for now. So I've got ho apostolos, the apostle, saying, you see, saying tauta, these things, in to hiero, in the temple, blepe, ton, kurion, sees the Lord. So the apostle, saying these things in the temple, sees the Lord. The basic sentence, of course, if we leave out this participle phrase, is the apostle sees the Lord. That's the basic sentence. This phrase is a participle phrase. It's kind of an adjectival modifier. It's an adjective using a verb, and so it's telling us what apostle we're speaking of. It happens to be the apostle that is saying these things in the temple. The apostle saying these things in the temple sees the Lord. Now, I'm going to mention to you that, generally speaking, to make it clear in English who you're talking about, you might want to put it more on the order of the apostle, while saying these things in the temple, sees the Lord. The present participle tends to emphasize action taking place at the time of the leading verb. But that's the basic idea. That should get you going. Let's take a look at the next of these examples. So just adding this example now, this again is on the same page. We have blepomen, ton apostolon, legonta, tauta in to hiero. Blepomen, we see, ton apostolon, the apostle. Here again I see I've got a participle. Only notice this time the ending is the accusative singular. So the accusative singular is going to be telling me that this is now being used as an adjective not to modify the subject of the sentence, which in this case is we, but to modify rather the direct object, because of course onta is a accusative and it's going to go with the direct object. And so we see the apostle legonta, add ing, saying tauta, these things in the temple. But just be very clear when you're translating that you make it certain that the legonta, saying, is applied to the apostle rather than to the we. It's not we saying these things in the temple, see the apostle, but we see the apostle while the apostle is saying these things in the temple. You get the difference there? The only way you know whether the participle applies to the we, which is part of this word, or the apostle, which is over here, is by the ending. The ending in this case is accusative, and the accusative tells me it's going to go with the direct object. So again, as you're translating, just be sure to make that very clear, and that's going to be the most important thing to keep in mind as you go along. Let's go to the next example. This example, which again is on the same page toward the bottom, proserkometha to apostolo legonti tauta in to hiero. Well, here's the vocabulary word that we have in this chapter. Proserkometha was from proserkomai, I come to. This is the first person plural, so we come to. Notice it takes the dative, and not surprisingly, to apostolo is in the dative. So we come to the apostle, and then I have legonti. Again, I add ing, saying tauta, these things in the temple. Now the question is, who is doing the saying these things in the temple? Well, it could be we. We is the subject of the sentence. We come to the apostle. We could translate it, we saying these things in the temple come to the apostle. But of course that's not correct, because I notice the ending here is the dative ending, and therefore has to go with the word that's in the dative case, namely to apostolo. And so we come to the apostle while the apostle is saying these things in the temple. There has to be agreement, in other words, between the participle and the word that's being modified. And in this case, we're telling you what particular apostle we're coming to, namely, it's the one who is saying these things in the temple. All right, the next exercise given to us by Machen is on page 105, and it reads, didaskomeno hupo tu apostolou proserkontai auto hoi douloi. All right, let's see what we can make of this. So I notice, first of all, I have didaskomeno. I notice that this is, of course, a participle ending. It's passive now. It could be middle or passive, but we'll assume it's passive. I notice that this omicron with the iota subscript tells me it's going to be the dative singular masculine. It could be, of course, be the neuter as well, but we'll see in the rest of the sentence it has to be masculine. So I'm going to put this in the passive, and usually the way that you put a participle in the passive is add ing to the word be. So it's going to be the word being taught, and we'll see how that works out in a minute. So let's just take a look at that. We have didaskomeno, being taught, hupo, by, to, apostolou, the apostle, proserkontai, they, third person plural ending on our vocabulary word proserkomai, they come, to him, auto, dative case, because proserkontai takes the dative. And now I finally find the subject of the sentence here at the very end of it, hoi douloi, the slaves. So the slaves come to him, and then being taught by the apostle. But the question is, who is being taught? So the way I think about this is hoi douloi, the slaves, come to him, and then this dative must go with him, you see, because it's dative singular. So the slaves come to him while he is being taught by the apostle. You see how that works? I'm going to look at the ending of this participle and notice it has to agree with the dative pronoun here. So the slaves come to him in the dative while being taught, or being taught by, hupo, to the apostle. You have to kind of triangulate this a little bit as you go through it, but pretty soon it becomes fairly straightforward and intuitive. But at the beginning, it can take a little bit of mental gymnastics to think it through. Let's go on to the next example. The next example is actually very similar to the one that we just saw. Let's take a look at it. It's didaskomeno, same word we had before. Well, we're going to notice the dative singular masculine ending. And again, we can anticipate that there's going to be a word over here that will be a dative masculine pronoun. So we know that these two are going to be connected. So far, that's what we know. Didaskomeno, being taught, hupo, to, apostolou, by the apostle. Proseilthon, this is from proserkomai, but of course you're going to notice here that we have the second aorist, so it's going to be they came. I know it's going to be plural, third person plural, because the subject of the sentence, again, is hoi douloi. So the slaves came to him. And now notice that the present participle follows the tense of the leading verb. So I'm going to say, the disciples came to him while he was being taught by the apostle. I want the time of the participle to be concurrent with the time of the leading verb. And because the leading verb is in the past tense, the time of the participle is going to be in the past tense as well. So the slaves came to him while he was being taught by the apostle. You get that? You see how that works? So that's basically the notion you want to keep in mind here. If we look at this next example, poru omeno in to hodo, proseilthon auto hoi mathetai autu. Now I see here we have poru omeno. This is from peruomai, I go. It's deponent. And so this ending, of course, is going to be middle or passive, but because it's deponent, it still has an active ending. So I'm going to translate it going. I've got the word go. I put ing on the end, and we'll leave it there for now. We'll see what transpires in the rest of the sentence. So going in te hodo, in the way, going in the way, proseilthon. They came, this is second aorist again, same as we had up here. They came auto to him. Who came to him? Well, hoi mathetai, the disciples auto of him. So his disciples came to him, dative ending on the participle, while he was going. Notice that the aorist here requires that the participle follow the time frame of the leading verb, while he was going in the way. His disciples came to him while he was going in the way. And now let's come to the third of these. We have poruomenos in te hodo eden taflon. So poruomenos, same verb as we had here, it is deponent, but notice we have the nominative, singular, masculine ending. So I know that going in this case is going to be discussing a masculine, singular noun in this sentence, which will obviously be the subject of the sentence. So going in the way, and then I see Aden, this is the second aorist of blepo, you recall. So he saw, and the word he is the subject of the sentence, and so he is going to be the one who was going. So I'm going to translate it, while he was going in the way, you see, he saw taflon, a blind man. Going in the way, he saw a blind man. But again, to remove any ambiguities, I want to make sure that it's not that he saw the blind man as the blind man was going in the way. That would put this in the accusative, you see. But rather, because it's in the nominative, it has to be while he was going in the way, he saw a blind man. I mentioned earlier that participles can also be found in the so-called attributive position. The attributive, you recall, involves placing the article right before the adjective. If we said ho agathos anthropos, the good man, we could also say ho anthropos, ho agathos, the man, the good one. The article immediately before the adjective means attributive. Well, if the adjective happens to be a participle, as in the case of legon, I can still put an article directly before it. In that case, it's going to be the saying these things in the temple, the saying these things in the temple, apostolos, apostle. And notice that this is now a little bit different than the use of the participle we've seen before. Ordinarily, I would have rendered this the apostle while saying these things in the temple, but if I put the article there, it ties it a little bit more closely. So it's going to be the apostle who is saying these things in the temple. Literally, the saying these things in the temple apostle. And then we go on with the rest of the sentence. So that's called the attributive, very common in the New Testament, and you're going to go through exercises here that will illustrate that point. All right, just to drive this point home, two more exercises that again are provided by Machen. Here, notice we have two very similar sentences. We have Adon, I saw, tous, apostolus, the apostles, legontas, tauta, saying these things. I notice that this is the accusative singular, or accusative plural, masculine participle ending, so it obviously goes with apostolus. I saw the apostles while saying these things, namely while the apostles were saying these things. The only difference between this example and this one is the addition of the word tous. I saw the apostles, the saying these things ones. And so this is going to be rendered, I saw the apostles while saying these things. Here we have, I saw the apostles who were saying these things. And in a sense, the addition of the article simply ties the participle phrase more closely to the noun that's being modified, whereas here it's more of a temporal connection. It's simply indicating something that's going on while the action connected with the leading verb also happens to be going on. So that's the difference between the normal use of the participle and the so-called attributive use of the participle. All right, the concluding examples that Machen gives us toward the end of this chapter should wrap up our conversation. So let's take a look at this. We have adon, I saw, ton, legonta, the saying, tauta, these things, in to hiero, in the temple. Literally, I saw the saying these things in the temple. This is the accusative singular masculine. So if I fill it in a little bit, I saw the one or the man saying these things in the temple. This is the substantive use because here we don't have apostolon or anthropon or some other word that would be in the accusative to fill in the rest of this. So I simply call it the one or the man. You see how that works? So that's the substantive use. Here we have a similar arrangement. Adon, I saw, tous legontas. This is the accusative, plural, masculine. I saw the saying these things. Then I'm going to imply into it men. I saw the saying these things men, or the ones, the men who were saying these things. Or it could be simply those who were saying these things. Just depends stylistically on how you want to translate it. The third one, ho adelphos, the brother, tes leguses. Well, notice here it's feminine and it's genitive, and so I know we're speaking here of a feminine object, so it's going to be the brother of the saying these things. Eston is, doulos, a slave. Because it's feminine, I'm going to have to insert, kind of invent, an English word to convey the idea that it's a feminine object here. The brother of the woman saying these things is a slave. So the brother of she who was saying these things is a slave, or something like that, something that conveys both the femininity of the term that's being used here and also the participle aspect of it. The next example from Machen, ho pistuon, the believing, ace ton ageronta, in the raising up, tous necrus, the dead, sodzitai, or is saved. So, he who believes, the believing one, you see, he who believes, ace ton ageronto, notice here's the accusative because it's going to be the direct object of this believing, so you can have a participle that functions as the object of another participle. He who believes in he who raises up the dead is being saved. This is the present passive, meaning being saved. So the one who believes in the one who is raising the dead is being saved. So notice here we have a participle and another participle, and this participle is functioning as the direct object of this participle, and this is the kind of thing that is quite common in the Greek New Testament. So you want to become quite conversant and comfortable with the way in which these participles can also interact with each other. Let's take the next one. To sodzon, the saving, tous anthropous, the men, to thelema, the will, to theou, of God, eston is. So what do we have? We have to sodzon. This is neuter, of course, so I'm going to render it something like that which, or the thing which. That which saves, sodzon, active, but it's a participle. That which saves, tous anthropos, the men. To thelema, this is of course a neuter noun, the will, to theou, of God, is the will of God. So that which saves the men is the will of God. And then finally, ta blepomena, the things being seen, notice the passive participle here, the things being seen, ou mene, do not remain eis ton iona forever. The things which are seen do not remain forever. An allusion, of course, to a statement by the Apostle Paul. But here we'll notice that it's the passive of the participle for blepo, blepomena, the things which are seen, in the nominative, neuter, do not remain forever. Okay, well, hopefully working through those examples gave us some help. I want to take a look at the first three of each of the exercises, and then once again we'll turn you loose to go to work on the rest of these. Let's take a look at the first of them. Diokomenoi, hupo tu archontos, proseukometha to theo. So I notice here a participle. First of all, it is middle or passive, and I'm going to assume passive. It's in the nominative, masculine, plural. So diokomenoi, being persecuted, and because it's in the nominative, I know that it's somehow going to be describing that which is otherwise the subject of this sentence. So being persecuted, hupo tu archontos, in the genitive, by the ruler. Then proseukometha, we've had proseukomai, which is I pray. This is the first person plural. We pray, to theo, to God. We, of course, is the subject of this sentence, and so I know that in this case the participle, which is in the nominative, must be describing the subject, which is we. So while we are being persecuted by the ruler, we pray to God. That's the sense of it. You may want to massage it into a little bit more convenient English, but that would be the basic sense of it. All right, the next exercise here is ho se dekomenos deketai kai ton kurion. Interesting, isn't it? The, ho, se is the or you in the accusative. So I know it's going to be the direct object of something. So the, you, dekomenos, from dekomai, receive. This is a deponent verb, and so I've got the passive participle ending. The receiving you, one. You see, that's the attributive use here. Deketai, receives, third person singular. Kai, also. Ton kurion, the Lord. The one who receives you receives also the Lord. All right, let's go ahead and take a look at the composition exercises. The first of these is, while he was still in the flesh, the Lord was saving those who were believing on him. So this phrase, while he was still in the flesh, idiomatically, we're going to use the word eti, yet, and then on, you recall, is the verb of being, and it's going to be translated being. So yet being is kind of the way we're going to bring this into Greek. Yet being in sarki, in flesh, or in the flesh. You'll notice the footnote that Machen gives you there about the idiom here. In flesh, routinely translated in the flesh. So yet being in flesh. Hokurios, the Lord, esodze, was saving. This is the imperfect, third person singular, was saving. Tous, the pistuantas, believing, the believing ones. Notice that we have here the masculine accusative plural, so it goes with tous. Tous pistuantas, the believing, eis auton, in him ones. Yet being in flesh, the Lord was saving the believing in him ones. That's basically the raw literal sense of the sentence, and then it does reflect basically what's going on in the sentence to be translated. Number 2, while we were being taught in the temple, we were being persecuted by the ruler. So while we were being taught, we know this is going to be a passive participle, didaskamenoi, being taught. I have it in the nominative because it's going to modify we being the subject of the sentence. So didaskamenoi, being taught, in to hiero, in the temple, e diokomatha, we were being persecuted. This is the imperfect passive, we were being persecuted, hupo to archontos, by the ruler. So while we were being taught, modifying we, the subject of the sentence here, while we were being taught in the temple, we were being persecuted by the ruler. And our final example, number 3, those who are being saved by the Lord know him who saves them. So, those who are being saved, hoi sodzamenoi, the being saved, and notice it's the subject of the sentence, so we have it in the nominative, the saved by the Lord ones, those who are being saved by the Lord, gnoskousi, they know. So here we have the subject, or the substantive use, functioning as the subject of the sentence. Those who are being saved by the Lord know, gnoskousi, ton sodzanta, the saving them one. So the one who saves them. Those who are being saved by the Lord know the one who saves them. Well, I hope you've been able to follow that discussion. As I say, participles are extraordinarily important, and they're not actually all that easy. I think some of the chapters in Machen are fairly straightforward, and it's just a matter of memorizing them. This one you have to sort of wrap your brain around exactly how the Greek mind works, and the syntax is enough different that you just want to think about it. And my recommendation is that before you attempt any translation into English, you just get the feel for how the Greek actually says these things in the Greek mind. The saying these things in the temple one. You see, that's the way the Greek thinks. Now, we won't translate it that way. An English speaker is going to think that's a pretty strange translation. But from a Greek point of view, that's the best way to get a feel for how this syntax works. And if you do that, then you'll find that as you go along, it's going to make the rest of your studies of Greek a lot more straightforward. Because this particular kind of construction is very, very common and used in many different settings that may or may not necessarily imply the use of a participle in any given particular circumstance. So get a feel for this. It's very important. Take your time with this chapter. Don't try to rush through it. But on the other hand, just work through each exercise. I've given you the answer key once again, so be sure to compare your work to the answers that I provided. And once you're feeling reasonably comfortable with this chapter, then come back and we'll move on to chapter 19, which is going to be very similar. It's not going to be a lot of new material, except that we're going to be exposed to the aorist participle, and that will add one new wrinkle to our understanding otherwise. So once again, it's been great to have you along. Appreciate your faithful attendance to these lessons, and we'll look forward to seeing you next time. Until then, God richly bless your continued studies of the Greek language.